Okay, great. So I think we'll get started there. Some more people will be coming in, no doubt, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for being here today. It's a beautiful sunny day in Vancouver right now. And for today's talk, we have a wide audience from all over the world. And as much as I miss being with you all in person, and I miss being able to take the speaker, Justin, out to lunch and dinner and continue the conversation, one little silver lining is that I am glad that we can all connect here at this time from all these different countries. And so I just wanted to say that even though we were coming in from all over the world using our copper cables and fiber optics and satellites to weave together the internet, I wanted to remind us that I am living on a particular piece of land. And in this case, it is land of the Squamish and Musqueam and the Tsleil-Waututh, some peoples who have lived here for thousands of years. And here in Vancouver, this is part of a larger Indigenous renaissance, and these people have been working hard to make their continued presence visible in a place that has largely tried to erase them and to shrink their land holdings. In Arthur Manuel's book, Unsettling Canada, which I recommend for those interested in the Indigenous presence in Canada, he talks about government-recognized Indigenous land holdings in Canada as constituting just 1/5 of 1% of the land mass. And he asks, what kind of an economy can be built from that basis? Yesterday, I was biking through the small official reserve land of the Tsleil-Waututh, and I noticed a Tsleil-Waututh police officer, the first I'd ever seen, with a radar gun, which reminded me that even in this small state-appointed territory, asserting sovereignty in many forms is a vitally important thing. And also yesterday, a friend told me that the Tsleil-Waututh would beach their canoes, they would paddle right across the inlet to this park that I often go to, and that's where they would land and then walk overland to the Fraser River, which is a place still to this day is one of the most important salmon rivers in the world. And we were talking about how interesting it would be to find that path. Where is that path today? You know, under the concrete. So I think that learning about the long history of Indigenous presence is an important step in work towards land back and work towards other forms of reconciliation that is more than just words. So today's talk is part of a memorial series in honor of my dear colleague, Sonja Luehrmann, who left us when she was far too young. So Sonja herself, while her work was mainly about modern Russia and its former colonies, was also deeply interested in working with our Indigenous neighbors. One time an administrator came up to me and asked about creating a Squamish summer camp for high school youth, and I immediately thought of Sonja, and of course she volunteered to help. Sonja always seemed to be doing everything, working as an editor of a journal, arranging endless workshops, serving on the university's ethics committee, and so forth. She's a brilliant scholar. She helped us to see in an academic world that was often publicly secular and deeply suspicious of Christianity, and it would be interesting to hear Justin's reactions to the conversations that he has about his work. But she wanted to show us the complexity and importance of these religious sentiments, and she was always alert to contradictions and surprises. In fact, she delighted in them. And so it was for this exact reason that I invited Justin Haruyama to speak to us today. In a minute, I will introduce Justin, but I just wanted to say that last year, when I first encountered Justin's fascinating work, I was taken aback by the surprising situation that he writes about. And Sonja would have loved to be here today, and she would have asked Justin really hard questions. But she would do so in the spirit of having us think more carefully, foster our own curiosity, and make us realize we don't yet know what we haven't yet asked, what we haven't yet thought about. So I would like to just provide a brief overview of our schedule in the Q&A. It's probably familiar to most of you. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the event by placing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. and we will answer them at the end of the talk, and I will be hosting the questions for Justin, sometimes bringing some together, figuring out the order of things to ask. So just a reminder that the event is being recorded and will be available on our departmental website in the coming weeks. And when it is available, we will send out an email to you. If you would like, there is closed captioning available, and you can enable it by selecting the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, and now just a few words about Justin Haruyama. Justin is a doctoral student in anthropology at the University of California at Davis. He finished his master's work at Davis and did his bachelor's at the University of Puget Sound nearby. His research is based on 28 months of fieldwork, both with Zambian Jehovah's Witness congregations, where they mainly preach in Mandarin Chinese in order to better convert Chinese expatriates, and in Chinese-owned coal mines where labor tensions may run high. Together, his work helps to challenge and complicate some of the usual understandings of China's massive expansion of investment throughout Africa, showing us unexpected and complex dynamics that work out on the ground. He has also written a number of papers about political developments in Hong Kong, as well as Zambian responses to the COVID pandemic. So please provide a warm welcome to Justin as this year's presenter of the Sonja Luehrmann Memorial Series. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Michael. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So please just let me know if at any point there are any technical difficulties, you can't see my screen or you can't hear me, anything like that. And before I begin, I just want to give a couple of prefacing comments. One is, of course, it's a great honor for me to be here today and to be able to situate my work in terms of Sonja's great intellectual legacy. Also, I want to say just briefly how I came to this project, which is in my wider study of relations between Zambians and Chinese migrants, relations that are often characterized by xenophobia or racialized violence. One thing that I was really impressed by and really admired was how witnesses fashion new kinds of relations with Chinese migrants in Zambia that really transgress these often xenophobic social norms and create new forms of conviviality and amicability. I will give the caveat that in terms of my participant observation work, I am very much only a student of the Bible. I'm only still just learning. So if there are any witnesses or Adventists who I also talk about in this talk, if you notice that I make any errors or misunderstandings, I would very much welcome if you let me know in the Q&A session. This, I try to explicate here what I learned from my interlocutors in Zambia. And also I should note that that may not be representative of global teachings of witness or Adventist organizations, particularly some of the comments that Adventists made that I describe in this talk. I don't want to attribute that to the global teachings of the Adventist organization. Instead, I think that was a localized Zambian discourse. So with that, I will begin. My paper is entitled History Written in Advance, Christian Prophecy, Chinese-Zambian Relations, and Diffracted Modernity. On a sunny but cool afternoon in Gombela, a community in southern Zambia, I sat down with a man named Jonah to continue our Bible learning together. I had first become connected with Jonah through the witness congregation that he attended, a congregation that, though it is overwhelmingly composed of Zambian congregants, conducts its meetings entirely in Mandarin Chinese. At this time, I had already been pursuing ethnographic fieldwork research in Zambia for a little over a year on the broad topic of Chinese migrant workers and investors in the country and on their relations with local Zambian people. Up to this point, I had focused my research on labor relations, specifically on the labor relations that pertain to Summers Mine, a Chinese-operated coal mine southeast of Gombela. Over the course of this research, I had come into contact with members of Jonah's congregation, and I was intrigued by the congregation's overall dedication to the study of Mandarin Chinese and to evangelization activities with Chinese migrants in Zambia. In fact, I found that the members of this congregation achieved a very great deal of fluency in Mandarin Chinese. Both of these activities were striking precisely because of their rarity in Zambia. In over a year of conducting research on social relations between Zambians and Chinese migrant workers, I had never before encountered any Zambians who could speak any variety of Chinese, nor among the other Zambian Christian groups I had spent time with, including Pentecostals and Adventists, had I ever found Christians who actively sought to proselytize to the Chinese community. As such, I began gradually spending more and more time with members of Jonah's congregation, eventually formally approaching them to ask if I could incorporate my experiences with them as part of my ongoing participant observation research and ethnographic research. The members of the congregation agreed on one condition, that in return, I also commit to learning more about the Bible with them. Since I also viewed this as an excellent opportunity to engage in participant observation, I readily agreed. And so I found myself sitting down with Jonah on this June afternoon in the outside seating area of Gombela's Chinese market to continue where we had left off on our previous Bible study session together. On this afternoon, Jonah brought his laptop computer with him, as he had promised that he would show me a couple of PDF documents he had downloaded from the Witnesses online library, entitled respectively, Detailed History Written in Advance and Chronology, that would help clear up some of the questions I had raised during our previous Bible study together. Specifically, Jonah promised me it would help dispel some of my many confusions regarding the prophecies in the book of Daniel in the Hebrew scriptures that provided a detailed outline for world history all the way up to the year 1914 CE and beyond. As we move carefully sentence by sentence through these two articles, Jonah explained to me that there were two basic kinds of possible history. These were history written regarding past events and history written in advance. Jonah pointed out that though the Hebrew scriptures provided an extremely detailed, meticulously documented history of past events, leading all the way from the creation of Adam, through the global flood, down through the exodus from Egypt and the foundation of the kingdom of Israel, there was about a 400-year gap in this history of the past, stretching between the governorship of Israel by Nehemiah under Artaxerxes I of Persia in the 5th century BCE to the birth of Jesus in 2 BCE. This gap corresponded to the end of the Hebrew scriptures and the beginning of the Christian Greek ones. And I should note that this graph that I've made here is not necessarily to scale. It just sort of shows the relative positioning of major historical events. Far from being silent on the history of this 400-year period, however, Jonah explained to me that the Hebrew scriptures provided a different kind of history, no less detailed or accurate than the history written of past events, namely the history written in advance contained within the book of Daniel. Point by meticulous point, Jonah demonstrated how the history written in advance provided by the book of Daniel specifically described the conquest of Babylon by the Medo-Persian Empire and that empire's own subsequent conquest by Alexander the Great, the fall of the Phoenician city-state of Tyre, the later division of Alexander's empire among his generals, known as the Diadochi, into 4 smaller empires and of the struggles between them, the beginnings and ends of Jesus's ministry as the Messiah, as well as the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans after Jesus's death. In fact, Jonah pointed out the history written in advance contained within the book of Daniel extended far beyond even the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE and the completion of the Christian Greek scriptures by the Apostle John and his death at Ephesus in 100 CE. This history extended all the way through the year 1914 CE, the year that World War I began, and also the year that Jehovah cast out Satan and appointed Jesus King of God's kingdom in heaven, thus initiating the last days of the current system of things on earth. Thus, what at first appeared to be large gaps in the Bible's historical record of past events, Jonah explained to me, were not in fact gaps at all, since the history written in advance provided by the book of Daniel and other portions of the Bible, such as the book of Revelation, described all of the important events during these periods, leaving nothing out. Now, of course, millenarianism and an emphasis on prophecy has been of great import to varying degrees in different times and places to many Christian groups for many centuries. Many of the most popular forms of Christianity in Zambia, which itself is an overwhelmingly Christian country, about 95.5% of Zambians identify as Christian. Many of the most popular forms of Christianity in Zambia today are explicitly millenarian or eschatological in orientation. And Zambians of many different Christian denominations casually speak of a coming end of the world that will take place very soon. A recognition of the rapidly approaching end of this current system of things, therefore, is not completely unique to witnesses in Zambia, nor is there deployment of biblical prophecy to anticipate it. What is quite unique about the practices of Jonah and members of his congregation, not shared widely among other Zambian Christians, are the witnesses' intense focus and close study of the ancient histories of Mesopotamia and the Levant, and on their use of these histories to calculate precise dates for the unfolding of biblical prophecy. The PDF documents that Jonah shared with me during our Bible study together, for example, were each many dozens of pages long and contained within them exacting detail, the dates assigned to the reigns of different Persian rulers, for example, or long discussions of the short versus long chronology in study of the ancient Near East. So here in my talk today, I focus on this use of history, the conclusions witnesses are able to draw from it that we are soon coming to the end of the current system of things, and the significance this has for contemporary Zambian-Chinese relations. As in Luehrmann's groundbreaking work, in which she showed how we could learn about religion in the USSR by reading explicitly atheist Soviet archives. So I suggest we can learn a great deal about the two easy assumptions of liberal secular modernity that govern a lot of contemporary Zambian-Chinese relations by examining the archive of the Bible and Zambian witnesses' exposition of it. Particularly, I think witnesses' understanding of theocentric history can help us re-examine the territorializing and therefore often racializing logics of the political nation-state form that dominates our world today, and also the perhaps overly self-confident humanistic assumptions of modernity in the ability of humans to wisely govern our shared more than human worlds through the operation of human reason and rationality alone. The Soviet bureaucrats and archivists Luehrmann describes recognized an optimistic historiography in which soon all peoples would be joined in egalitarianism, harmony, and human flourishing through the inevitable laws of history, and recognized religion as an inverted world consciousness in response to an inverted world of social alienation engendered by capitalism. Witnesses similarly recognize an optimistic teleology that will soon lead to human flourishing, finally, after many thousands of years, through the inevitable workings of divinely provident history. But they recognize we must revert our focus to its proper form, in their view, by arguing it is the rule of Jehovah God, not socialism, that can right the wrongs of the world. So to return to Jonah and his fellow witnesses and their use of history for a moment. Jonah and his fellow witnesses engaged in more than just the invocation of history. Their practices also included centrally the elision of certain kinds of history. The fact explained to me by Jonah that the history written in advance provided by the Bible, or indeed any kind of biblical history, leaves nothing out, is an interesting one because these biblical histories do seem to leave out many kinds of happenings that are precisely important constituent parts of other forms of history. It is certainly not the case that Jonah or his fellow congregation members ever denied the actuality of occurrences taking place outside of Southwest Asia in the Eastern Mediterranean before 100 CE, or anywhere in the world thereafter. They recognize many kinds of historical accounts that describe myriad happenings all over the world that were not very specifically detailed in the Bible. Jonah himself was an avid reader and keen student of what he termed secular history, the kinds of historical accounts that come from sources other than the Bible. But Jonah's main interest in secular history was the ways in which it confirmed for all to recognize the divinely sanctioned history described in the Bible. Jonah was able to cite a wide range of precise dates and figures that had been ascertained by secular archaeologists and historians, and which corresponded to the exact history laid out in the Bible. But for those periods and regions of the Bible on which the Bible was, for those periods and regions of the world on which the Bible was mostly silent, such as almost all regions outside of Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean basin, and the entire period from 100 CE to the late 19th century CE, Jonah pointed out that only the broadest generalizations were of very compelling interest. Mostly this was the important conclusion, these broad generalizations led to the important conclusion that could be inferred from these regions and periods, including, for example, Zambia's own history before and during British imperialism, that human beings are not capable of wisely or justly governing ourselves, and only a theocratic society, that is to say, one ruled by Jehovah God and his representative Jesus, will make possible true human flourishing. In this way, Jonah explicitly relegated occurrences that are recorded in secular history, but had no confirming or validating correspondence with biblical history, to the realm of what Pavanelli suggestively has termed quasi-event. Happenings which do not fully participate in the ongoing sweep of eventful history, and therefore lack a certain kind of substantiality. It is not exactly the case that quasi-events, of course, can be said not to have happened. It is rather that in the grand scheme of history, they fade so far into the background of unimportance that their occurrence or non-occurrence is just not very significant or relevant. By dividing accounts of the past and future in this way, between the divinely sanctioned eventful histories of the Bible on the one hand, and the mere quasi-events of secular historical reckonings on the other, Jonah and the members of his congregation implicitly inverted a power dynamic more often seen in ostensibly global hegemonic accounts of secular history. From the subaltern histories described by Chakrabarty to Tausig's analysis of cosmological enactments and Pavanelli's theorization of the post-colonial archive, it is precisely the time of the more than human, more than natural, the time of gods, angels, and spirits, the time that lies outside the secular, that is often relegated in secular culture to the insubstantial realm of the quasi-event, or worse, of non-event. In a somewhat similar vein, De la Cadena makes a distinction between the claims of a hegemonic history versus the counter-hegemonic subaltern voices of what she calls a history. In De la Cadena's account, history as such appears as a kind of master narrative, necessarily grounded in Western secular assumptions about what kinds of things constitute fact and evidence and which do not, thereby excluding other kinds of storytelling about the past. De la Cadena posits a history as a counter to this hegemonic practice of history, arguing forcefully for a history's eventfulness in Pavanelli's terms, despite the fact that a history lacks the kinds of facts and evidence that could allow it to be included as part of history tout court. Though De la Cadena works hard to recover and rehabilitate the eventful character of a history, nevertheless, there seems to be a kind of ambiguity in her ethnographic descriptions. It is not always clear that her ethnographic interlocutors themselves always view the a history which they record as being truly eventful. In one memorable moment in her ethnography, they begin to burn a major ahistorical archive as fire kindling, making ambiguous whether or not this ahistorical archive is actually an archive or not. For Jonah and his congregation members, the history which they recount is no less a challenge to what Chakrabarty calls secular time than the a-history De la Cadena describes. But there is also no doubt that for Jonah and his fellow witnesses, the history they describe is, indeed, extremely eventful history. In fact, they see it as far more eventful than the history described in secular accounts, precisely because the history they recognize from the Bible can comprehend the grand unfolding plan that humanity is caught up in. Unlike secular histories, which merely see many trees, the history the witnesses recognize can take in the forest, again, of the grand plan for humanity that has been in process for thousands of years now. Writing from the perspective of a post-colonial, explicitly decolonizing space, all of the theorists that I've just briefly mentioned work in different but related ways to rehabilitate non-secular forms of temporality in history that they feel are being, in a quite colonial way, excluded from mainstream discourses of hegemonic secular history. All of them do this by marking the non-secular forms of history that come to matter in the spaces from which they think, linguistically setting them off from secular history. We might think of secular history like with a capital H in different ways, not as history tout court or history as such, but rather as subaltern history or post-colonial or simply a history. Like the ethnographic and historical examples these theorists have described so richly, the history invoking practices of Jonah and his fellow witnesses also challenge the domineering assumptions of a secular time that is empty, homogeneous, and linear, as described by Chakrabarty, into which the natural events of the material world can be slotted, but not the supernatural events of the divine. But they do so in a quite different kind of way. So Pavanelli, for example, has argued that if archive is the name we give to the power to make and command what took place here or there in this or that place, and thus what has an authoritative place in the contemporary organization of social life. This means then that the post-colonial archive cannot be merely a collection of artifacts reflecting a different subjugated history. Instead, the post-colonial archive must directly address the problem of endurance of the otherwise within or distinct from this form of power. Thus, the post-colonial archive takes on a decolonizing role as it subverts and undermines from the enduring place of the otherwise, the power of the, in this quote, unmarked, except with quotation marks, archive tout court, to authoritatively and definitively, quote, make and command what took place here or there, in this or that place, unquote. In this decolonizing project, we can see a challenge to the totalizing agendas of secular modernity, which make claim to a monopoly on knowledge and the truth, which by definition can only be natural truths about the material world, properly documented according to standards of academic history, from a place that self-consciously casts itself as the otherwise, a kind of shadow modernity. But despite also departing just as substantially from the hegemonic assumptions of secular history, the biblically authored histories articulated by Jonah and his fellow congregation members were not couched in terms of being an otherwise, and they made no claim to subvert the totalizing power of the archive to, quote, make and command what took place here or there, in this or that place, unquote. Rather, they laid claim to that exact power for the only true archive that could ever provide absolute certainty in their account of historical events. Because that certainty is provided by a truthful God, which is to say the archive of the Bible. In this way, we can see a certain process of diffraction, to use Barad's term, of modernity at play. By appropriating modernity's claims to the truth is the precise term Jonah and his fellow witnesses used to describe their religious teachings. Witnesses in Zambia recognize themselves not as an otherwise or a shadow to modernity, but rather as modernity's true representative, as the true interpreters of properly academic, scientific, and historical knowledge. Since it is only with knowledge of the Bible that the errors that academic science and history have made can be recognized. The true corrected modernity these witnesses lay claim to through their historical knowledge is not the modernity traced, for example, by Winter in her critical analysis of the progressive articulation in the European West of man one and man two. Jonah often pointed out, for example, that the teachings of witnesses are in complete accord with mainstream secular science, excepting where that science has made errors concerning, for example, its postulation of an evolutionary theory of species development. Jonah thus rejected the evolutionary and biocentric assumptions regarding human beings, or indeed any other species, that Winter identifies as constitutive of the genre of man two. Even more fundamentally, however, Jonah and his fellow witnesses stridently rejected the humanistic assumptions constitutive of the earlier genre of man one. Such humanistic assumptions of man being freely able on his own volition to be able to employ his faculties of reason and thus to govern himself in a prudent and rational manner without the aid of divine providence. And I should note here I'm using all male pronouns because that's the way that Winter describes it as a very male-centered discourse. These assumptions were the humanistic assumptions were the very antithesis of the theocentric and theocratic truth that witnesses in Zambia sought so earnestly to share with others. This antithesis was well illustrated in a conversation I had with Esther, another member of the Gonvela Mandarin-language congregation. So over a series of conversations that had taken place over several months, I had been discussing with Esther whether direct political action or activism, activities I had learned that witnesses generally oppose, could ever be a helpful response to the ills of the world. In a long conversation in Mandarin with Esther one afternoon, for example, I asked if, for example, the abolitionist movement in 19th century USA could be thought of as a helpful response to the system of slavery. By way of response, Esther gave me an analogy. She pointed out that if a patient arrived at a hospital with a debilitating, life-threatening disease, and if all the doctors at that hospital did was to alleviate the symptoms of that disease for a time, instead of treating its underlying causes, this could not really be regarded as a successful medical intervention. In a similar manner, Esther explained to me the racial prejudice, discrimination, and even violence that continues to pervade society in the United States, including the necessity for a Black Lives Matter movement, which I had just been telling her about earlier in our conversation, demonstrated that the political action taken by abolitionists in the 19th century had merely dealt with the symptoms of the problem, not its underlying causes. The underlying problem, Esther argued to me, was that without proper guidance, human beings themselves would continue to be greedy, self-interested, and cruel, which meant precisely that problems like racial discrimination and prejudice could never go away through human action alone. Instead, Esther argued to me, the only thing that could permanently put to rest all of the problems I had described to her was the establishment of what she called in Mandarin, Yehovah Wangguo, the kingdom of Jehovah. The diffracted form of modernity articulated by Jonah and Esther is not then the evolutionist and biocentric genre of the human that Winter glosses as man two, nor is it the humanistic valorization of man's capacity for reasoned thought and organization into political states that she glosses as man one. But the genre of the human described by Jonah and Esther nevertheless bears a genealogical relationship with articulations of the ethnic class man. Like these, it also draws from an understanding of the world informed by the great chain of being, the medieval and Renaissance European conception in which humans are fallen from the heights of perfect being represented by God and the angels, yet are nevertheless far above and ontologically distinct from all other animals and non-human beings in importance and nature. They also share the totalizing and universalistic aspirations of modernism, themselves genealogically related with the universalizing discourses of earlier forms of Christianity. By articulating a vision of soon-to-be ended modernity that is explicitly opposed to both conventional politics and the nation state as a political form, since all contemporary nation states, as witnesses understand it, are under the power of Satan, these witnesses are also involved in creating a realm of everyday practices of relationality quite different from others in Zambia. By doing so, they envision and so help to create a different kind of political order, a theocentric and theocratic one that, in refusing the rituals and pageantry of the nation state, erases nationalized and also, in many cases, racialized divides. This is especially apparent when the practices of temporal politics and articulation of eschatological modernity by witnesses are juxtaposed with those of other Christian groups with whom I conducted fieldwork in Zambia. As I mentioned, the overwhelming majority of Zambians, 95.5%, identify as Christian. And like witnesses, most of the other most prominent Christian communities in Zambia are extremely focused on evangelization before a widely understood rapid approach of Armageddon. Unlike witnesses, however, most other Zambian Christians that I encountered in my fieldwork are deeply committed to the identity of the Zambian state, nation state, as a constitutionally declared Christian nation, which it has been since 1994. A national identification which many Zambians express with pride, but which Jonah and Esther found faintly ridiculous. For many non-witness Zambians, however, this proud identification as a Christian nation sat uneasily with the widespread arrival of Chinese migrants and investors, whom many Zambians described as worshiping the god of money rather than the Christian God, and who, with their ill-gotten money, were quote unquote buying up, as one popular radio program put it, the country of Zambia. As a result, whereas Jonah, Esther, and the other members of their congregation were deeply invested in learning Mandarin Chinese, eating Chinese foods, participating in Chinese culture, all in an attempt to form close relationships and friendships with Chinese migrants and bring them to the truth before the great peril of the coming end of the current system of things. No other Christian community that I encountered in Zambia was willing to engage with Chinese migrants in this way. For contrast with Jonah and the witness congregation he belonged to, I would like here to draw attention to another congregation of deeply pious Christians whom I spent time with in Zambia, namely a congregation of Seventh-day Adventists. This congregation of Adventists did not, like Jonah's, engage in any practice of learning Chinese or evangelizing to Chinese migrants, even though the congregation met just a short walk away from a major Chinese-operated coal mine. Indeed, for members of this Adventist congregation, evangelizing to the many Chinese migrants who live so nearby was basically unthinkable. One Saturday, I was sitting with a group of elders from this Adventist congregation. The elders were all of varying ages, but were exclusively male, as we shared a meal during the noontime break in our all-day sunrise to sunset Saturday worship service. Several of these elders began complaining bitterly of how, in their view, Chinese people were, to repeat this popular radio program, buying up Zambia. As an example, they pointed to the nearby Summers coal mine, which is owned and managed by an extended family from China's Jiangxi province in Southeast China. The elders of the church noted that the Chinese owners of this mine were extremely obstinate in refusing to grant even the smallest of wage increases to their workers, even as inflation was hitting the Zambian economy hard, and would even on occasion resort to firing shotguns to disperse crowds of protesting workers demanding better working conditions. Their complaints slowly transitioned from complaints about the very worldly, here and now growing presence of Chinese migrants in Zambia to somber reflections on the fact that when we were all brought up to heaven at the time of Christ's impending second coming, and when they made these comments, they seemed to include me in this encompassing we of people who would be going to heaven, we would certainly find no Chinese people there in heaven when we arrived. I asked the elders how it could be that there would be many kinds of people brought up to heaven and yet no Chinese. The elders explained to me that this was the case because fundamentally, Chinese people have no souls or heart, described with the word moyo in Chitonga, which is the language in southern Zambia that they were speaking. The contrast between, on the one hand, these elders of the Adventist church who averred the total impossibility of Chinese people being brought to heaven because of Chinese people's lack of souls, and on the other, the witnesses of Jonah's congregation who learned Mandarin and spent upwards of 70 hours a month witnessing to Chinese migrants precisely so they might be saved as part of God's chosen people, is obvious. Important here is the different approaches to history, the different processes of what Simon Coleman terms historiopraxy at play in each of these congregations. Jonah certainly had negative impressions of specific Chinese individuals that he had worked with or otherwise come into contact with. And to give an example of this, in terms of his secular work, so outside of witnessing to Chinese migrants, his job where he earned money, he had been working for a Chinese company and he was doing IT work for them. But by the time I met him, he had given up and he would no longer work for Chinese companies because he felt too often they asked him to do things that he felt were unethical, such as providing misleading information on official Zambian government forms or facilitating bribes with Zambian government officials. And so by the time I met him, Jonah would only interact with Chinese in a witnessing context in terms of bringing them to the truth, but would no longer interact with them in terms of secular work or in terms of employment. Right, so he had decided to no longer work for Chinese since he felt that they often asked him to do things that he felt were unethical and which violated the dictates of his religion. But when I asked him about the prevalent narrative in Zambia at the time, the Chinese were buying up the country, expressed not only by the elders at the Adventist church, but also, for example, on several popular talk radio programs, as I've mentioned, Jonah averred strongly that all of this was really beside the point. Jonah pointed out to me that very, very soon, there would be neither a Zambia to buy up nor a China to buy it. Because in fact, all nations would be destroyed in the coming Great Tribulation that he felt was likely to be taking place as early as next month. In these end of time circumstances, the only thing that really mattered was to follow Jesus's example and take up his call to go and make disciplines of people of all the nations before the opportunity to bring additional people to the truth is lost forever. However, the collapsing of eventful history to that which is contained within biblical histories, including both those regarding past events and those written in advance, is not without its difficulties. As I have already described, there is much in secular history, such as recent transformations in Zambia with the increasingly obvious presence of Chinese investors and migrants, that figure in the discourses of witnesses such as Jonah as not quite fully eventful. But this applies to events far in the past as well, especially to events described by secular or other non-biblical histories that did not take place in the ancient Near East. For example, Mr. Zhang, a Chinese man in about his mid-40s who had been working in Zambia for about 5 years in a Chinese-operated construction company, told me that while he was very interested in the printed pamphlets and teachings brought to him by members of Jonah's congregation, he nevertheless was doubtful of the veracity of all the historical biblical accounts they related to him, for precisely the reason that they seemingly failed to include any mention of events that took place in China, which of course has its own very long and well-attested history. Mr. Zhang pointed out that China had a very ancient history, perhaps in his view, even more ancient than most of the events described in the Bible. And he found the lack of mention of any of the events of Chinese history in the biblical text to be quite puzzling. Though he had attended a few of the gatherings of the witnesses, this lack of correlation between Chinese history and biblical history was one of the main reasons that he did not wish to fully accept the teachings of the witnesses or to become a member of their congregation. Here again, there was creative tension in the practices of both eliding and invoking history pursued by Jonah and his fellow witnesses. So it is not exactly the case, as I've mentioned, that Jonah or other members of his congregation would ever totally deny the eventfulness of the Chinese history to which Mr. Zhang was alluding to. But they tended to recast this history in terms of the ways that it might intersect with the histories, both of past events and written in advance, that are contained within the Bible. One evening, for example, Jonah and I went to the home of two other congregation members named Robin and Miriam and their two daughters to participate in a family worship session, which was a weekly event. After we had concluded the family worship service and eaten some dinner together, Jonah helped Robin to print out some flashcards of Chinese logographic characters, known as in Mandarin as Hanzi, so that Robin could continue learning and improving his literacy in Mandarin. As we sat around waiting for the flashcards to print, Jonah explained to me and Robin how many of the ways in which Hanzi are meaningfully constructed from smaller constituent parts are in fact direct references to biblical accounts. He often used this fact as evidence when he was witnessing to Chinese expatriates, he told us, that ancient Chinese people had knowledge of important biblical events, such as the experiences of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the global flood. Jonah gave us a few examples of the way in which the composition and structure of Hanzi demonstrate the awareness that ancient Chinese peoples had of biblical events. For example, he explained to me, the Chinese character xiang, which has a number of meanings, but one of the main ones of which is to desire, is composed of the elements for tree, for eye, and for heart. Jonah pointed out that this composition of the character to desire was a direct reference to the story of Eve desiring the forbidden fruit in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, which describes how Eve saw the fruit hanging from the tree of knowledge of good and evil with her eyes, and that this elicited feelings of desire in her heart. Similarly, Jonah demonstrated how the character Chuan, yes, let me make sure. Oh, do I have all? Yes, okay. Similarly, Jonah demonstrated how the character Chen, meaning ship, is composed of the elements for boat, for eight, and also a character that usually means mouth, but can also mean number of people. So just like in English, how we talk about like head of cattle, 20 head of cattle to refer to a number of cattle. So in Chinese, you can refer to like 20 mouths of people, or it's the same character as for mouth to refer to a number of people. And that this was a reference to the story of Noah and his family, cited in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20, which describes how Noah's Ark carried the 8 members of Noah's family to safety. As a final demonstration, Jonah showed me the character Kwang, which means crazy, which he pointed out was composed of 2 components. The component on the left, I recognized to mean dog, but Jonah told me actually meant beast. And the component on the right means king. Jonah told me that this character was a reference to the madness that overtook King Nebuchadnezzar II late in his reign, in which Jehovah God cursed King Nebuchadnezzar to begin acting just like the beast. When I asked Jonah how Chinese people usually reacted when he provided these demonstrations of the biblical origins of Chinese written characters, Jonah told me, do I have the quote? Maybe not. Most Chinese are fascinated. Actually, they didn't know that these characters have a reference to the Bible. They think maybe their culture has nothing to do with the Bible. They're fascinated to see that they have some background in the Bible in their culture. All cultures have similar stories about the Bible. All these stories were actually handed down orally before the Bible was written. By demonstrating the deep interlinkages of Chinese and biblical history, indeed the great awareness that ancient Chinese people have of the most important events of the Bible, Jonah discursively erased a national division of histories that might otherwise be used, for example, to differently mark off racialized or ethnicized categories, Chinese and Zambian. In Jonah's articulation of history, Neither historical Zambians nor Chinese were God's chosen people, this role being assigned to the Israelites. But in the aftermath of Jesus and his disciples' spreading of the word of Jehovah God, all human beings now have the opportunity to come to the truth and to become Jehovah God's new chosen people. Thus, for Jonah and Esther and the other members of their congregation, all political attachments to the nation state are actually Satan orchestrated distractions from this fundamental truth, that we could all be one people, Jehovah God's chosen people, through our humble obedience to his will. The witnesses took this admission very seriously. As with many Zambians, for example, most members of the witnesses' congregation loved watching professional football, or as in America, as we know it, soccer. While Jonah and I were watching a televised football match one evening with Robin and Miriam and their daughters, however, Robin explained very seriously that despite the intense excitement of the match, it was important never to root for the Zambian team over any other national team, even silently in one's heart. This was a temptation of Satan to allow the God-intended unity of human beings for the legitimate joy of a sporting contest to be divided by nationalist sentiment. As I have already noted, this earnest commitment of witnesses to the definite potential, if not actuality, of all human beings to become equal members of Jehovah God's chosen people was not only a discursive one. In a myriad of practical ways, the witnesses of Jonah's congregation regularly transgressed social boundaries that otherwise tend to dominate social encounters between Chinese migrants and Zambians in other contexts. As an example of these social boundaries, at Summer's Mine, where the members of the Adventist congregation and the Chinese management staff had lived directly adjacent to each other, literally just a few feet away from each other for many years, Zambian and Chinese staff would eat communally, freely among themselves, but never with the other group. Zambian staff, despite some of them participating in the preparation of the Chinese staff's food, expressed disgust that any Chinese meat dish might be full of dog meat, and as a result would never touch Chinese food, even though none of them had personally witnessed a dog ever being slaughtered in this way. For their part, Chinese staff members tended to be completely disgusted by the Zambian practices of eating with their hands, and generally refused to eat any food that had not been thoroughly cooked after being touched by a Zambian person, as well as also often to eat off of any dishes that had not been washed since being touched by a Zambian person. At one point, the Chinese staff at the Summers Mine even resorted to publicly dumping out in the communal yard some foods that had been left in the shared refrigerator by Zambian employees. By contrast, Jonah, Esther, and most of the members of their Chinese congregation, who were primarily Zambian, but included a couple of Chinese members, had come to greatly appreciate Chinese cuisine, often congregating at Chinese restaurants in Gombela that are otherwise almost exclusively frequented by Chinese expatriates and not by Zambians. These witnesses eagerly sought, as part of their efforts to bring people to the truth, to form amicable friendships with Chinese migrants, often inviting Chinese migrants to their homes for large communal dinners and socializing and game playing. Though highly cosmopolitan in terms of their practical rejection of national, racialized, or ethnicized divisions, however, witnesses in Zambia are not similarly open to other religious practices or understandings of history. My friend Daniel, a Zambian man who belongs to a Seventh-day Adventist congregation, once commented ruefully on how he had no objection to accompanying witness friends to their religious meetings, but that it was unthinkable for his witness friends to reciprocate and accompany him to an Adventist meeting. The way that Jonah encompassed Chinese history within biblical history through his analysis of Hansa had a similar tenor. For Jonah, the potential for the truth perceived by the witnesses in the Bible to accept and include all people everywhere was capacious, but only on the terms of the witness religion itself and their understanding of the truth of the Bible. Any alternative conception of Chinese history, as indeed also of Zambian history, that did not correlate with the histories of past events or histories written in advance contained in the Bible were not truly eventful, or might actually be completely wrong, as in when secular accounts contradicted the historical account that seemed to be present in the Bible. To Jonah, these non-biblical secular histories were mere quasi-event, possibly having occurred, but not really very significant or substantial in the grand sweep of history. This totalizing discourse, of course, as I have mentioned and have argued, shares strong genealogical and discursive links with long traditions in Christianity that have contributed to the development of modernity as it is self-understood in the West. But there are other elements of the admittedly heterogeneous self-understandings of modernity that witnesses directly challenge, as I've noted. Insofar as purification, as Latour has argued, of human from other than human and purification of human from other than human and teleological humanistic emphasis on expanding individual freedom through the unique human capacity for reason and rational self-rule have also been elements of secular narratives of modernity. Witnesses in Zambia make a distinctively different kind of claim to modernity. Rejecting the basis of rational human self-rule in the political state that has been progressively articulated since the discursive formation of what Winter has identified as Man 1, as I've mentioned, Jonah and his fellow witnesses instead point to the extreme damage human-governed nation states have wrought in the world. They argue that now, of all times, with the ruins of human-wrought disasters that have taken place since 1914 all around us, all humans everywhere should, with the help of the Holy Spirit, submit themselves totally to the rule of Jehovah God and his representative Jesus, and to the guidance in biblical interpretation provided by Jehovah's faithful and discreet slave, which is to say the governing body of the Global Witnesses organization, which is based in Warwick, New York. Witnesses argue that, in stark contrast to all human-ruled polities, it is only Jehovah God and Jesus who can rule humans in a wise, just, and benevolent way. Embracing a cosmopolitan vision of a world without nations, while simultaneously rejecting the spiritual and religious pluralism of the liberal state as unsound, witnesses forcefully lay claim to a theocratic and theocentric modernity that, in their historical understanding, will soon, with the help of Jehovah God, replace the flawed teleologies of secular modernity. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin, for that talk. You covered so much ground. There's so many fascinating details, and I'm really too impressed that you expanded from already really challenging work in the with the coal mining and with the witnesses to also look nearby with the Adventists too, to really show us a very close kind of comparison to that. I'm gonna give a few minutes for more questions and to appear in the Q&A, but I have so many questions of my own for you to begin. And one thing is, I found it really interesting that in your characterization of what different scholars have said around notions of modernity or temporality, from De La Cadena to Chakrabarty to Winter to others, I noticed an interesting form of like dichotomization between this kind of dominant secular notion or Western notion and then something else. And I found it really interesting because there was an easy temptation to say, oh yeah, what you're seeing in Zambia is something else. It's formed by a certain kind of a particular form of religious temporality and notion of the past, present, and future. But I think it seemed like you consistently refused to characterize it in that way. I think you're kind of trying to come up with, in some ways, a kind of third space that doesn't neatly fit in relationship to what you've encountered in terms of other schemas of understanding the diversity of temporalities among the world. I'm just curious if you could, you spoke a bit about that in your talk, but if you could just elaborate a bit on that. And I'd be also really curious for people like Jonah. It seems that understanding history and representing history is just so key to his whole practice. So how did you try to ever explain any of these other ways of understanding, like the history of De La Cadena or others to Daniel, or how did he react to them, or how might you imagine he would? Let me just start off with that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And, certainly I welcome feedback on this framing that I'm providing. So as you know, I think, and so this is drawn from my ethnographic experience. And I think the way that witnesses articulated their own worldview to me. So I think a lot of the literature on like alternative modernities is really trying to sort of like recapture or rehabilitate a space that can exist alongside a sort of a dominant hegemonic secular modernity, right? And so I think a lot of that literature is sort of explicitly about like, okay, well, sure, there's the dominant hegemonic modernity, but there's going to be this other kind of modernity too that's is enduring, to use Pavanelli's term. And so I thought about that a lot as I was thinking about my material with ethnographic material with Jonah and his fellow witnesses. And I just thought that didn't really capture what they were saying, because they very much, as I understood them, are not trying to recapture a different space. They're trying to say that, in fact, they recognize the truth, a universal truth, that all human beings, it's really important to join this truth. And it's not about, recapturing sort of a post-colonial space. Of course, I'm speaking a little simplistically, but it's not about recapturing a post-colonial space that can exist alongside larger hegemonic logics. It's about saying, no, like that hegemonic logic is just totally wrong, or at least it's really erred in some significant ways. And actually, we are the ones with the knowledge of the Bible who can reinterpret that logic. Certainly, as I said, I mean, for Jonah, I mean, in his view, the witness understanding of science and history is actually the correct one, right? I mean, it's not against science or academic history. It's correcting what the errors have been in some specific errors in secular science or secular history. So I'm really explicitly trying to rework sort of the framing that is often given to alternative modernities, and say that witnesses are not trying to create a space for an alternative modernity. They're just trying to say, actually, we are the true inheritors of modernity that will rapidly lead to a new and better world.
Yeah, and in that way, it seems then what they're talking about is so different than the models that assume this kind of wide scale hegemony. It's like and I think then that's something more powerful and bigger in that way. It's really interesting too to see like relationships to, like, I guess this is based on Bishop Ussher's kind of idea of the origin of around 4004, which is also akin to Mormonism. And I had interesting discussions with like Mormon archaeologists who are excellent archaeologists, but are bound by that temporality. And so it's really interesting to see these kind of like forms of relationship building that come on in a temporal way. I'm curious, like within witnesses too, are there kind of active debates around, I mean, I guess this is a small, relatively small congregation of about 50 people, but are there debates around their own forms of temporality or how they engage with others? Or is this a case where Jonah is kind of like the main charismatic historian slash, you know, head person of the group, and does he kind of set the terms through which people understand these broader situations?
Well, I think, so generally I would say witnesses, compared to my experiences with other Christians in Zambia, there's a very, how do I say, sort of like a unidirectional flow of information and of biblical interpretation. Witnesses in Jonah's congregation really prided themselves on the fact that, like, each week, for example, they would be going through the exact same teachings that every single witness congregation in the whole world would be going through. They would be doing the exact same reading. They would be answering the exact same questions, of course, translated in 100 different languages.
Yeah.
And also the format of meetings is a lot of there's a text that is produced by the global organization that then we study in advance, and then it's sort of like a question and answer session of sort of answering to make sure that we understood the text correctly. So I think in my experience, relative to other Christian groups, there were not a lot of debates about interpretation amongst Jonah's congregation. Instead, there was a pretty clear understanding that interpretation was coming from the global organization and was shared then by all witnesses around the world. And it was sort of, the goal was to master that information in the meetings together, and then be able to share that that information with everyone else in Zambia to bring them to the truth.
That's so fascinating. No idea how it worked in this kind of unified central way that just disseminated globally like that. That's really interesting. Here we go. I wanted to get to some of the questions from the audience. Here's the first one here. They say, it is interesting that people in Zambia have acquired fluency in Mandarin. How do Zambians develop and sustain their skill in Mandarin, especially literacy? Is the linguistic experience of your study group primarily biblical? What about their competency in contemporary secular Chinese? And there's a few more smaller ones. I'll just let you go there so you don't have too many questions all at once. So go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, excellent question. There was a range of Mandarin proficiency within the congregation, for sure. Many members of the congregation were older, in their 60s, and had just started learning Mandarin to be part of this congregation. So, not everyone found it very easy to just pick up Mandarin from scratch with no previous background in it. So Jonah definitely had one of the highest proficiencies in the congregation, also Esther. So in terms of literacy, there's a great deal of literacy because there's so much engagement with written texts in the meetings of the congregation, which we were all Mandarin Chinese. So we would read these texts in Mandarin Chinese, and then in spoken Mandarin, we would have question and answer sessions where we are, sort of explicating this text that we have all read in Mandarin. So definitely a great deal of literacy. And And I think because the main goal, of course, ultimately is to be able to talk to Chinese migrants in a language that they feel comfortable with, and to encourage them then to come to the truth. So, of course, witnesses' vocabulary is not only biblical in orientation. I mean, they just want to be able to go to Chinese people's homes and just chat with them and just hang out. And, you know, again, and host Chinese people at these social gatherings at their own homes, where, you know, we watch a TV program and we have dinner, things like that. So they had, of course, a very great deal of biblical religious vocabulary, because we were constantly reading biblical texts in Mandarin, in a Mandarin translation of the Bible. But they also had a lot of secular proficiency as well, because they wanted to talk to Chinese who otherwise had no background often in with Christianity or the Bible, and to befriend these Chinese as a way of encouraging them to come to the truth. So, I mean, they had proficiency in both, but I will emphasize, I mean, there was a range. You know, some people had more intermediate Mandarin, and then some people like Jonah and Esther had really complete fluency.
Okay. And I'm just curious, what languages did the folks in the congregation already speak before they were learning Mandarin?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So different languages. Certainly English, which is the national language of Zambia since British colonialism. So all members of the congregation were pretty well educated, and most educated Zambians are fully proficient in English. And then in terms of people's first languages, there was a mix. Some people spoke Nyanja, some people spoke Ichibemba, some people spoke Shitonga. So there was a mix of sort of ethnic backgrounds of first languages.
Okay, so you're talking about people's third or fourth language that they're
learning, exactly,
starting in their 60s.
Exactly, right. Which Zambia has a lot of languages, so that's not untypical. But learning Mandarin is very
yeah. I think I know most of the answer to the next. These are the same attendee, but I'd like to hear you talk about it. They say, is the interest in Chinese restricted to the religious group you studied? And they're wondering if Chinese involvement in Zambia could be regarded as colonial and therefore a motive for learning Chinese.
Yes, so excellent question. That speaks to some wider questions in my overall project, particularly regarding the question of neocoloniality. Very briefly, I guess I'll just answer that question by saying that so a lot of scholars have criticized the idea that Chinese are neocolonial in Zambia or in Africa. I do not. I say that there is Chinese presence in Zambia is pretty neocolonial in nature, but they're one of just many foreign countries that have very neocolonial relations with Zambia. So almost the entire Zambian formal economy is under the control of foreigners. Chinese are just a minority of that. Most come from like Canada, Australia, Switzerland. I think that whole setup is neocolonial. But I don't think that Chinese are exceptional in that regard. Mm-hmm. Certainly the witness emphasis on learning Mandarin Chinese. So all of these Mandarin language congregations are only about a decade, about 12 years old now. They've all come up within the last 12 or 13 years. And they're growing quite rapidly. And it's a response to the massive influx of Chinese migrants and investors that have come to Zambia. And so they're trying to meet that as they try to meet with other groups. So there are also French language congregations that are trying to reach out to Congolese refugees who have come to Zambia. There's also Gujarati language congregations who are trying to reach out to Indian migrants in Zambia. So it's not only Mandarin.
And these are all witness
Yeah,
congregation.
exactly. All witnesses.
So it's just very distinctive of the witness kind of modality is
exactly
to do this intentional multilingualism,
multilingual,
which is so fascinating, right? Because it's so different than the typical missionization, like from a center going abroad and then learning whatever language one goes to. Whereas in Zambia, it sounds like they're all staying within national bounds, but adding another language to find another group. Right?
Okay. Yeah, and I think, I mean, maybe we could relate that to sort of like neocolonialism. I mean, in the sense that lots of foreign investors are coming to Zambia all the time. So if you want to reach foreigners, actually, it's an effective tactic to sort of do missionization in place. And to learn the languages that those foreigners feel comfortable in, and then to convert them right there. Especially also because it's quite dangerous to evangelize, for witnesses to evangelize in mainland China in the PRC. So reaching Chinese nationals actually is a lot easier in a place like Zambia.
Right. Great. Here's another question for you. So it says, presumably most Chinese workers are in Zambia primarily to earn money and seek financial security for themselves and family. Since the witnesses tend to de-emphasize material financial security in favor of spiritual security, did you observe efforts to impart that view upon Chinese? And if so, how did Chinese respond?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yes, so of course, as a quickly growing community, the Chinese migrant and expatriate community in Zambia is relatively diverse within itself, and people come for different reasons, and different mixtures of reasons. So absolutely, as you suggest, many a primary reason for many Chinese migrants in Zambia is to make money. But I would say almost as equally a common reason is Chinese coming to Zambia, or at least staying in Zambia once they've been there for a while, because of a different lifestyle that it offers. So it's very, very common for Chinese migrants in Zambia to talk about how life in China right now is just too stressful. There's too much pressure. It's all this like cutthroat, not necessarily cutthroat, but like sort of rat race to get ahead. And they really appreciate that Zambia has a slower pace of life. And so I think where witnesses are most successful is in converting to Chinese, evangelizing to Chinese migrants, is amongst those migrants who are interested in sort of a different kind of life, a different style of life. So another Chinese man that I knew, who also was met regularly with the witnesses, even if he hadn't joined their congregation formally. So he mentioned how like he felt like he'd always had a lot of anger management issues. And in his perspective, which I also strongly shared, witnesses have a outward demeanor of always being extremely calm and friendly and sort of relaxed and just very kind, really, to almost everyone they meet in their efforts to bring people to the truth. And he really admired that. And he said, that's the sort of life and the sort of person I want to be, right? So I think, for Chinese migrants who are more interested in not only making money, but also sort of a different kind of self-fashioning or a different approach to leading their life, that's when the witnesses' teachings, I think, are more appealing, more compelling.
Right. That actually is so fascinating. The whole idea of like a witness habitus, like a witness way of being, like this self-fashioning, and something that even as much as like their efforts at biblical conversion may fall at least on temporarily deaf ears, as it were, for this man, that something about their way of being in the world as their comportment and their way of interacting with others would be so compelling. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, extremely compelling.
Yeah, and I don't know if that is something that is discussed at witness meetings as in an explicit way about how one should be and interact with others, or is that something that you found? Do you think like Jonah demonstrates that by example, and it's never even said, or it's never even discussed, or people are never even criticized? It just kind of emerges organically, or is this even something of a wider kind of witness modality of personhood or something like that we're seeing? Do you have any sense of that?
I think it's primarily implicit. I mean, it does get sort of explicitly articulated in specific moments. So for example, one thing, in addition to this sort of question and answer regarding witness texts, another feature of witness meetings is there would often be sort of like a role play skit of witnesses would go up, and in Mandarin, one person would play like a Chinese migrant, and then another 2 or 3 people would play, the witnesses who were coming to their home to try to speak with them, and they would sort of act out how that encounter should go.
Wow.
And they would prepare that in advance, and they were really proud of it.
And they would they enact skepticism or something, or kind of reluctance too?
Yeah, exactly. Of course, usually the end of the skit would end with the migrant, really interested in learning more. But yeah, initially they'd be sort of, oh, I don't know anything about that. Like, what is that? Who is Jehovah God?
Right.
So that's one way that they would sort of like role play these encounters. And then also, so the text that we studied together covered like many different topics, including sometimes about history, but also sometimes about sort of, self-fashioning or habitus, as you say. So, about different virtues that the Bible teaches us. And we would study different biblical figures and how they enacted these virtues in their own lives, and how we can follow that in our lives. So it did certainly come up as well. But I would say mostly it was sort of an implicit thing that was done by example. That this was how all the other witnesses behaved, and then that was sort of the expected norm of this very sort of kind and friendly and amicable outward demeanor.
So interesting. Great. Here's another. We have a bunch more questions. Some people also just saying thanks so much, like they're looking forward to reading this in publication, but we're kind of running low on time. I think I'll try to choose 2 more sets. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I wanted to ask, given that colonialism and Christianizing in the post-colonial South Indian context took women as the site of confrontation, making them repositories of honor, could you speak as to how women are being reframed, if at all, in your larger project? Really interesting. Yeah, I haven't really heard the gender dynamic of things, so I don't know if that's something that came up or that was prominent, or.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, so, I mean, gender is really central in my project in other ways. So I have another piece looking at sort of kinship and familial relations that are being formed between Chinese migrants and Zambians, and it's usually Chinese men with Zambian women, and sort of how enactments of both masculinity and femininity are being worked out in these relationships. But with regards to the Jehovah's Witnesses, the gender dynamics there, I wouldn't say it's not something that is explicitly commented on very much. Certainly, there is a very gendered division of roles within the congregation. All the sort of the visible leaders of the congregation are all men. If a woman, for example, were giving a public talk or translating a Chinese text, they would often wear a head covering, sort of in compliance with a biblical mandate that woman prophetesses should cover their head. So they didn't do that in a normal life, only when they were in sort of an official religious capacity. But on the other hand, I mean, probably 60% of the congregation were women. And certainly many of the most active members of the congregation were women.
And then the Chinese, are assuming, are overwhelmingly male, if not exclusively, or what's going on there?
Right, but the only two, that's true. So Chinese migrants that are being evangelized to are overwhelmingly male because the Chinese migrant community in Zambia are themselves overly male. But actually, the only two permanent Chinese members of the congregation were women, one of whom was married to a Zambian man. They had met in China when he was there. And then another elderly female Chinese doctor who was joining the congregation just in the final weeks of my fieldwork, just as I was leaving. So yeah, I think that's a provocative question. I think there's probably more I could be doing to think about gender dynamics in all of this. So I appreciate that question.
Right. Yeah, thanks. And then the last one I'll have here. Some might interpret the uniformity of thought among the witnesses as imposed from above. On the other hand, can you describe you do describe a process of intensive study. Can you comment on the level of personal commitment and internalization of the teaching in these groups?
Yeah, I think so, within the wider witness community, being in a foreign language congregation like I was means I was interacting with sort of a select subgroup of witnesses in Zambia, and namely those witnesses who were sort of so committed to being true witnesses and to really spreading the truth that they were willing to learn this foreign language from scratch, which I mean is difficult. I mean, they spent so huge amounts of time trying to learn Mandarin. I mean, it's not at all easy. And so, I mean, this congregation that I was with, I think were the most sort of committed witnesses. So they had come from other congregations in English or Nyanja or Ichibemba, languages that they were already fluent in, and they had come to this Mandarin language congregation in order to live out their commitments and their obligations to Jehovah God. So I think, I mean, within this congregation, there was not, they were pretty committed to that. And they were pretty committed to the truth that was being distributed by the global organization. I suspect that in other congregations, that might not be so much 100% the case, but it was pretty much the case in the congregation I was with.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I'll keep it at that. We have so many more questions that we're curious about with your work, with your talk today, which was wonderful. Just want to thank you again. I wanted to let everyone know that our department will be hosting another talk just about 3 weeks from today. We'll be sending that out within a week. It's Angela Wiley, who's a prominent scholar in queer studies and science and technology studies. So we're looking forward to that in the future. But Justin, thanks so much for your wonderful responses too, really thoughtful. A colleague just texted me to say they could feel Sonja's presence here today and the kind of inquisitive and nuanced conversation. And I really thank you for your talk and your answers to our questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great honor for me to be here in Sonja's memory. And I really appreciate this opportunity to share my work with you all.
Okay, great. Look forward to seeing you in person.
Yes, fantastic. I look forward to that in the future also.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.